Nothing dramatic happens, no warning, no sharp pain, but every day, around the same hour, your energy quietly disappears. You wake up fine, morning works normally, you even feel productive before noon. Then, somewhere in the afternoon, usually between 2 and 4 p.m, something changes. Your focus softens. Simple tasks feel heavier than they should. You reread the same sentence twice. Small decisions suddenly feel exhausting. You don't feel sick. You don't feel injured. You just don't feel available. So you blame sleep, or age, or stress. But here's what confuses most people. Years ago, this didn't happen. You used to work longer days, think clearly in the evening, stay sharp late into the night if needed. Now the body hasn't collapsed, yet the consistency is gone. And what makes it more frustrating is this. It happens at almost the exact same time every day. That means it's not random. This video is not about motivation, and it's not about pushing harder, because the afternoon crash is not laziness, and it's not simply getting older. It's a predictable biological pattern, one that starts showing up when certain systems stop recovering the way they used to. Understanding it changes how you plan your day, how you eat, and how you judge your own discipline. Because the problem is not that you have less energy. The problem is your energy is no longer arriving when you expect it. Most people believe the afternoon crash is caused by what they did that day. Too much work, too little sleep, too much stress. But the body rarely reacts instantly. What you feel at 3 p.m. is usually the result of a process that started hours earlier, sometimes even the night before. Your energy doesn't run on willpower, it runs on regulation. Every morning your brain releases a signal that tells the body it is time to be alert. This signal is not just mental, it is chemical. Your temperature rises slightly, your blood pressure increases, your attention sharpens. You don't notice this happening, you only notice that you feel ready. For many years this system works smoothly. The body predicts your day correctly, but over time the prediction becomes less precise, not broken, just less synchronized. So the morning still feels normal, because the first half of the day depends mostly on activation, and activation is the easiest system for the body to maintain. The second half of the day depends on stability, and stability is harder. Around early afternoon, your brain naturally lowers its alertness signal. Everyone experiences a small dip, even children. But when recovery systems are strong, the dip is shallow and short. You barely notice it. When recovery weakens, the dip becomes deeper. The important detail is this. Your brain is not losing energy. It is losing access to energy. Inside the body, energy is stored in several forms. The brain does not hold much of it directly. It constantly requests supply from circulation. In younger years, the response is immediate. The request is made and fuel arrives quickly. But as regulation slows, a delay appears. So at the exact moment your brain expects fuel, the delivery arrives late. That gap is what you experience as fatigue, not exhaustion, not sleepiness. A strange in-between state, awake but ineffective. You sit in front of the same task, yet your mind moves through it like heavy water. This is why caffeine feels different now. Years ago, coffee added energy. Now coffee mostly restores normal, because you're no longer boosting performance, you're compensating for timing. The body still has capacity, but the coordination is off. Another system joins this pattern, blood sugar regulation. In the morning, insulin sensitivity is naturally higher. Food is processed efficiently. Energy feels stable. By afternoon, sensitivity decreases. This is normal biology. However, when recovery is reduced, due to accumulated stress, irregular sleep timing, or years of compressed schedules, the decrease becomes exaggerated. So instead of a gentle drop, you experience a sharper decline in available fuel. Again, not because you ate something wrong that day, but because the body cannot adapt quickly anymore. This is why the crash often appears even on calm days. Nothing special happened, yet the same hour arrives, and the same heaviness follows. Your nervous system is attempting a daily reset. It expects a brief rest phase, a moment where stimulation lowers and repair processes begin. When life doesn't allow that pause, the system forces one anyway, not by shutting you down, but by reducing clarity. It's protective. Your brain is preserving stability for the evening. And this explains the most confusing experience. After the crash passes, some people feel a second wind at night. Energy returns, sometimes even stronger than afternoon, because the repair phase finally finished. So the problem was never total energy. It was timing mismatch between demand and recovery. The afternoon is simply the moment where the mismatch becomes visible. You're not deteriorating during the day, you're revealing the recovery you didn't get before the day started. And that is why trying to push harder rarely works. You're applying effort to a coordination problem. The body is not asking for motivation, it is asking for alignment. Until alignment returns, every afternoon will feel like resistance, even when the workload is reasonable. What makes the afternoon fatigue unsettling is not the fatigue itself, it's the memory. You remember working longer hours without thinking about energy. You remember evenings that still felt usable. You remember being tired only after the day was finished, not in the middle of it. So the mind concludes something simple. I'm just getting older. But aging rarely works that suddenly. Most biological changes happen gradually, long before you notice symptoms. What changed was not only your body. What changed was how long your body has been adapting. In earlier years, recovery happened automatically. You slept, and the body repaired. You ate, and energy stabilized. You rested briefly, and alertness returned. Because your daily life contained natural variation. Schedules were less compressed. Meals were less synchronized to deadlines. Your attention shifted between movement, conversation, and mental effort. Even if you worked hard, your effort had rhythm. The body depends on rhythm more than intensity. When effort rises and falls throughout the day, the nervous system learns when to activate and when to restore. Over time, life removes that variation. Work becomes continuous instead of cyclical. Tasks become cognitive instead of physical. Breaks become optional instead of built in. You remain seated longer. You think longer. You postpone pauses longer. Nothing dramatic changes in a single year. But each year the body adapts slightly to predict this pattern. The brain begins preparing for sustained focus rather than alternating focus. At first, this adaptation feels like improvement. You become more efficient. You tolerate longer work blocks. You need fewer breaks. But adaptation always has a cost. To maintain continuous output, the nervous system reduces sensitivity to fatigue signals. You stop noticing early tiredness. That sounds beneficial, until recovery depends on signals you can no longer feel. Years later, the body still follows the same compressed pattern, but repair systems need stronger cues to begin. Morning works because sleep provided a full reset. Evening sometimes works because the system finally forces restoration. Afternoon becomes the conflict zone. It is the first moment the brain expects a micro-recovery, but your schedule no longer contains one. When you were younger, movement accidentally solved this. Walking between places, changing environments, standing conversations, unstructured time. These were not exercise, they were interruptions. Interruptions allow the brain to switch networks, from focused attention to the background processing. That switch restores clarity. Modern routine removes those switches. You stay in one posture, one cognitive mode, one sensory environment. So instead of refreshing, the brain accumulates demand. The afternoon crash is not a failure of stamina. It is the moment the brain reaches a boundary it used to cross unconsciously. Another difference is predictability. Earlier in life, sleep timing fluctuated, but demand was flexible. Now sleep timing fluctuates while demand stays fixed. The body tolerates irregular sleep better when the day can adjust. It struggles when the day remains rigid. So small deficits accumulate invisibly, not enough to stop you in the morning, not enough to stop you at night, but exactly enough to appear in the middle. This is why weekends sometimes feel different. Not because you slept dramatically longer, but because expectation decreased. The nervous system relaxed its prediction, and once prediction relaxes, stability returns temporarily. You didn't suddenly lose resilience. You spent years training your body to ignore early signals while asking it to remain consistent under constant conditions. Eventually, consistency demands a pause. The afternoon became that pause, not because the body weakened, but because it finally stopped compensating. You are experiencing delayed feedback, the cost of stability showing up at the first available opening in the day. And once you understand that, the frustration changes. You're not trying to recover your 20s. You're learning how your current system schedules recovery so you can work with it instead of against it. Once people notice the afternoon crash, they try to fix it immediately, not by understanding it, but by overriding it. Because the drop feels like a problem that appeared today, so the solution must also be immediate. This is where the cycle begins. The first reaction is stimulation. More coffee, sweeter drinks, short bursts of urgency, and it works, briefly. The brain becomes alert again. The task continues. The day moves forward. So the mind learns a powerful lesson. Fatigue can be solved by force. But the afternoon dip is not a lack of activation. It is a lack of coordination. When you stimulate the brain at the wrong phase of its cycle, you don't remove fatigue. You postpone regulation. The nervous system was preparing to rebalance. Instead, it receives another command to perform, so it complies. But the cost moves later. This is why evenings often become restless after heavy afternoon stimulation. The body still needs its reset. It simply shifts the timing. Sleep becomes lighter, recovery becomes incomplete, and the next day, the dip deepens slightly. Not enough to alarm you, just enough to repeat the solution again. Coffee becomes routine, not because you need energy, but because your body expects interruption.
Understood.
The second reaction is restriction. People notice eating makes them sleepy, so they eat less at midday. Lunch becomes smaller, sometimes skipped. This feels logical. Less digestion, less fatigue. But the afternoon crash rarely comes from digestion alone. It comes from unstable availability. When intake drops too low, the brain becomes cautious. Instead of spending energy freely, it protects reserves. You feel slower not because energy disappeared, but because the brain refuses to spend it quickly. So you respond with more stimulation. Now the body receives two opposite signals: conserve and perform. It obeys both badly. Focus becomes narrow, mood becomes flatter, errors increase, and the fatigue feels mental instead of physical. The third reaction is mental pressure. You interpret the dip as loss of discipline, so you push harder, you hold posture tighter, you force attention, you remove breaks completely. This creates a hidden shift. Attention uses metabolic resources. The harder you hold focus, the faster you consume stability. Without pause, the brain cannot switch modes. Background processing never activates. Repair never begins. So effort produces diminishing clarity. You're not working longer. You're working through resistance. Many people notice they reread the same paragraph repeatedly, not because they cannot understand it, but because the brain cannot reset context. A brief disengagement would restore comprehension faster than persistence, but discipline feels like continuation, so continuation becomes habit. The fourth reaction is compensation at night. After the crash passes, alertness often returns. Now you finally feel capable again. So important tasks move later into the evening. You think better at night, so you trust night productivity. But this steals recovery from tomorrow. The brain delays shutdown to finish the work it postponed earlier. Sleep starts later. Depth shortens. Morning still works because activation is resilient, but the afternoon inherits the loss. Over weeks, the dip shifts earlier. What began at 4 p.m. appears at 3 p.m., then 2:30 p.m. You interpret this as aging. In reality, it is accumulated timing debt. The fifth reaction is weekend recovery. You sleep longer on days off. You feel temporarily restored, so you assume you caught up. But the nervous system runs on rhythm, not totals. Irregular recovery does not stabilize the cycle. It confuses prediction. Monday becomes harder not because of work, but because timing lost consistency. The body prepares for one schedule and receives another. By midweek, partial adaptation returns, just in time for the pattern to repeat. Another subtle mistake is constant environment. You remain under identical lighting, temperature, and posture for hours. The brain measures time partly through sensory change. Without change, internal timing drifts. The afternoon dip feels heavier in static environments because the brain cannot recalibrate alertness cues. Even standing briefly or changing rooms can restore orientation, not psychologically but neurologically. Finally, the biggest mistake is interpretation. You treat the crash as failure. So every day becomes a test of endurance, but endurance intensifies the cycle because you are solving a scheduling issue with effort. the body begins to associate work with resistance. Motivation declines not from attitude, but from prediction of friction. Over months, confidence drops quietly. You trust yourself less in the second half of the day, so you plan less meaningful work there. This reduces engagement. Low engagement reduces stimulation variety, and reduced variety deepens the dip. The pattern becomes self-confirming. You believe afternoons are unproductive, so they become unproductive. Not by ability, by expectation shaping behaviour. What makes these mistakes persistent is that each one works temporarily. Stimulation works today. Restriction feels cleaner. Pushing feels responsible. Night work feels effective. No single day reveals the cost. Only repetition does. And repetition hides itself because change happens slowly. The afternoon crash is rarely caused by one habit. It is created by layers of reasonable decisions made in isolation from the body's timing. You're not ignoring health. You're optimizing output without coordinating recovery. So the solution is not more discipline. It is different placement of discipline. Not at the moment of fatigue, but before the cycle begins. Because once the dip arrives, you are negotiating with chemistry, not character. Once you understand the afternoon crash as a timing conflict, the goal changes. You stop trying to eliminate it. You start positioning it. Because the dip itself is not harmful. It is a transition phase, a biological handoff between effort and restoration. The problem begins when your schedule demands peak performance during that handoff. So the first adjustment is not about food, or coffee, or supplements. It is about expectation. Most people divide the day into only two categories: work time and rest time. But the body operates in three: activation, maintenance, and reset. Morning is activation. Evening becomes recovery. Afternoon is maintenance. Maintenance does not support heavy decision-making. It supports repetition, organisation, and low-conflict tasks. When you ask the brain for creativity at the wrong phase, it resists. Not because you're incapable, but because the network required for creativity is offline. So begin by relocating thinking tasks. Important decisions move earlier. Structured execution moves later. Afternoon becomes operational, not strategic. This alone removes much of the psychological friction. You no longer interpret normal biology as failure. The second adjustment is micro-transition. The brain does not refresh from long rest alone. It refreshes from state change. A brief shift in sensory input signals a phase change. Standing helps. Walking helps more. Looking into distance helps most. Not for exercise, for orientation. The visual system resets attention rhythm. Even 2 minutes outside a static visual field can restore processing speed because the brain recalibrates prediction errors. Most people try to relax by staying seated and scrolling. This keeps the same cognitive channel active. You rested the task, but not the system that performs tasks, so the dip persists. Instead, interrupt sameness. Change posture. Change depth of vision. Change sound environment briefly. You're not adding effort. You're closing a loop the brain expected to close automatically. The third adjustment is timing of intake. Food influences alertness less by content and more by alignment. A large meal immediately before the natural dip deepens it. A moderate meal slightly before it stabilizes it. Because the body anticipates predictable supply. When supply arrives after decline begins, resources go first to storage regulation, not cognition. So the sequence matters more than the ingredients. Eating earlier does not increase energy. It prevents sudden redistribution. This is why identical meals feel different depending on hour. The fourth adjustment is caffeine repositioning. Caffeine works best as prevention, not rescue. When taken after the dip begins, it stimulates alertness while regulation is incomplete. You feel wired but unfocused. Taken earlier, it supports the activation curve instead of fighting the maintenance phase. So rather than increasing amount, shift timing slightly forward. Less intensity, more stability. Over days, the nervous system stops expecting emergency stimulation and resumes internal pacing. The fifth adjustment is protected pause. Not a break for entertainment, a break for neural reset. 5 to 10 minutes where input decreases instead of changes rapidly. No conversation. No scrolling. No problem solving. Just reduced demand. This allows background networks to reorganize context. Many people resist this because it feels unproductive, but the brain processes unfinished information during low input. Afterward, comprehension returns faster than continuous effort could produce. You're not losing minutes, you're restoring continuity. The sixth adjustment is evening boundary. Afternoon fatigue often leads to night productivity. Night productivity delays shutdown. Delayed shutdown weakens next afternoon, so protect a stopping point. Not because you are tired, but because the next day depends on predictability. The brain prepares tomorrow's regulation during the last hours before sleep. Irregular endings confuse that preparation. Consistency stabilizes afternoons more than extra rest. The seventh adjustment is movement distribution. You don't need long workouts to influence the dip. You need frequency. Short movement before the expected drop maintains circulation timing, so the brain receives steady supply instead of correction bursts. Movement after the crash feels like recovery. Movement before the crash feels like prevention. Again, placement matters more than intensity. The eighth adjustment is light exposure. Indoor environments flatten biological time cues. The brain relies on contrast between bright and dim periods to maintain alertness rhythm. Without contrast, the maintenance phase lengthens. Brief daylight exposure early in the afternoon sharpens the boundary between activation and reset. This does not energize directly. It clarifies timing, and clarity reduces fatigue perception. The ninth adjustment is task sequencing. Begin the day with complexity, end with closure. When the brain finishes open loops late, it continues processing into the night. Closing loops earlier allows deeper disengagement later. Afternoon then becomes a bridge, not a battleground. The final adjustment is interpretation. You're not meant to feel identical at every hour. Consistency does not mean constant intensity. It means predictable variation. Once variation is expected, you stop measuring discipline by resistance. You measure it by alignment. Some hours are for thinking, some for doing, some for preparing tomorrow's thinking. When you align with those phases, energy appears steady, not because biology changed, but because demand matched supply. The afternoon no longer feels like losing the day. It feels like turning the page. And once that happens, fatigue stops feeling personal. It becomes information, a signal telling you which mode the brain is ready to support. You don't defeat the dip. You give it a role, and when it has a role, it stops interrupting the rest of your life. The afternoon fatigue feels physical, but what troubles most people is psychological, because it quietly challenges an identity you held for years. You were the person who could continue, the one who pushed through, the one who stayed reliable regardless of conditions. So when your energy stops cooperating at the same hour each day, it doesn't feel like timing. It feels like decline. And decline carries fear. Not fear of being tired, fear of becoming limited. But what is changing is not your capacity to function. It is your relationship with control. Earlier in life, control meant overriding signals. You could ignore hunger, ignore fatigue, ignore distraction, and performance still followed. The body absorbed inconsistency because recovery reserves were wide, so discipline meant persistence. Continue long enough, and results appeared. Over time, the body stops rewarding persistence alone, not as punishment, as instruction. It begins requiring cooperation. The afternoon becomes the first daily moment where force stops producing quality. You can still continue, but continuation no longer guarantees clarity. This is unsettling because it changes what effort means. Effort used to mean doing more than you felt ready to do. Now effort begins meaning doing the right thing at the right phase. That feels weaker at first, less heroic, less impressive, but also more sustainable. Your value no longer comes from resisting limits. It comes from organizing around them, and that shift affects more than productivity. It affects patience. People often notice they become shorter with others during low-energy hours, not intentionally, but because interpretation slows. When the brain processes information less efficiently, ambiguity feels heavier. Small misunderstandings feel larger, so emotional reactions increase not from personality, but from timing. Once you recognize this, you stop judging your character by moments of depletion. You begin protecting conversations instead of forcing them, and relationships become calmer without anyone changing temperament. The same applies to decisions. Many regret choices made late in the day, not because they lacked wisdom, but because evaluation requires surplus attention. When attention is reduced, certainty feels attractive, so you choose faster and reconsider later. Understanding your rhythm prevents unnecessary correction cycles. You're not avoiding responsibility. You're placing it where thinking is strongest. There is also a quieter realization. Energy patterns shape how you see yourself. If every afternoon feels like failure, confidence erodes slowly. You begin planning life around avoidance, important tasks only in certain hours, challenging conversations postponed, new projects delayed, not from laziness, from mistrust of consistency. But once the pattern is predictable, confidence returns. Not confidence that you will feel perfect, but confidence that you know when you won't. Predictability removes anxiety. You stop waiting to see what kind of day you will have. You already know. And knowing allows preparation. Preparation restores agency. This is why the afternoon dip often appears around the same period of life for many people. It marks the transition from a body that tolerates randomness to a body that rewards structure. The lesson is subtle. You are not becoming fragile. You are becoming specific. Specific in sleep timing, specific in work order, specific in recovery. The reward is not endless stamina. It is reliable clarity. And reliable clarity is more useful than occasional intensity. You think better on average, even if you no longer peak as unpredictably. Many people spend years trying to feel how they once felt. They push afternoons harder, delay nights further, compress mornings tighter. But the body is not asking you to go back. It is asking you to synchronize. Life becomes less about proving endurance and more about preserving continuity. You remain dependable, not because you can ignore limits, but because you understand them. The afternoon fatigue stops being an interruption. It becomes a boundary marker, a reminder that performance now depends on arrangement, not pressure. And once you arrange your day around reality instead of memory, something unexpected happens. The day feels longer again. Not because hours changed, but because resistance decreased. You no longer spend energy fighting the wrong moment. You spend it using the right one. So the real reason you feel worse at 3 p.m. is not that your energy disappeared. It is that your body stopped hiding the schedule it has always followed. Now you can finally see it. And once you can see it, you can live with it, instead of against it.